Well, I'll say good evening now, even though our holding slide is still up. I think we're having an issue or two taking the holding slide down, everybody. So just bear with us. I think I'll say might as well just say something while we're waiting for this to be sorted out so we can begin properly. I think there looks very good, but there's a hitch. It doesn't want to go away, the holding slide. I guess it's not the end of the world, but I'd like to see Charles. Maybe wouldn't like to see me in big full technicolor, but here's Charles coming. I'll welcome Charles. You can come on in, Charles. I'll welcome you now while we're working on the holding slide. I would just say welcome everybody and to our law school webinar. I was just speaking to our colleagues in the alumni office before we began, and I think this is there we go. This is the third year of our law school webinar series, and I generally been quite successful where I invite colleagues in the law school to come and speak about their areas of interest and expertise to alumni in particular, but also to current students or staff or members of the community. And this is the second of this autumn semester's series. We've got one to come in December, and this time I'm delighted to welcome a relatively new colleague in the law school to present, have a conversation with me tonight on his area of expertise. Charles Mack, who's a lecturer in the law school, has been working with us now for coming up to 6 months, and prior to that he was well, still is, but he was at the University of Glasgow reading for his PhD, and Charles is just informing me he's at a very exciting period of his research career, and in almost at the point of submission of his thesis to the University of Glasgow. And then he had some go ahead from his supervisors, which is an important step. And then we'll have it will take a few months, I'm sure, the examination process, and then a viva. So I guess before we even get going, I say we wish Charles all the best of luck in that. I'm sure he'll be fine. So Charles has been in I guess by way of introduction is his PhD was on an area related to what we're speaking about tonight, about sovereign debt restructuring, and I think that brings us now to well, just say one more general point about, okay, I hope we have a few questions. Normally we do in our webinars, and I think it's best if you if anybody out there that has a question puts it in the chat box, and so come to the end of our Charles and I discussion, which is normally 30 minutes, 35 minutes or something rather, where I'll ask Charles questions about his area, and then we'll have questions. So please do that. If there's no stupid question, I always say, but please do use the chat box if you have any. And as I say, we'll speak about 35-40 minutes, and then I'll open for questions, and be done for sure by 6 o'clock, so everybody has time for their dinner or whatever else they're doing. Okay, so I say welcome again, Charles. The title of our webinar is when a country can't pay its debt, or I was saying, try to sex it up a bit, when a country goes broke. Charles wasn't too keen on that. Utilizing trust law as a mechanism for sovereign debt repayment. Sounds a bit complicated and esoteric, but I don't think it is, and it's I think a critically important issue for those countries involved, and we'll speak a bit about that right now. So welcome, Charles.
Oh, hi. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so much for your kind introduction. So before we start, I think it would be more prudent for us to define what does it mean by sovereign debt. So basically, sovereign debt is essentially money that a country's government has borrowed. It's like a personal loan, but for a country. When a government needs more money than it has from taxes to pay for things like building roads, schools, or hospital, it can borrow money from investors, other countries, or international organizations. So these loans are called as sovereign debt because they back by sovereignty of the nations, which means that the government's power and right to manage its own affairs. The government promises to pay back this money, usually with some interest, over a certain period. Just like what the person borrowed money and has to pay it back, a country also has to make sure it can repay its debt. If it cannot, it is known as default. So sovereign debt is important because it allows country to invest in its future, but it also needs to be managed carefully to prevent financial problems. So
yeah, interesting. If I could just come in a bit about that. That's very interesting. So almost as an analogy with a personal loan by somebody or companies taking out a loan. But this case, it's just one of the approximately 200 countries on the world who are borrowing money to, I guess, to invest in their own countries, or indeed, I guess, pay the bills of running the government or the armed forces or whatever.
yeah.
And I was just curious about this, so I looked it up, and the UK's public debt, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Charles, I think is about £2.5 trillion of the national debt of the United Kingdom. I was just Googling that today and looking it up. So that's a huge sum of money that the UK has borrowed to and has to pay back. Okay, so a sovereign debt's default when, say, if the UK, and there must be a sizable interest payment on that, but I guess other countries is sizable interest payments. Oh, indeed, and then of course, if a capital comes due, if it's similar as well, and a country is unable to pay,
Yes.
then there's a default. Is that right? Can you
Yes,
give us any
exactly.
examples? I mean, I can think of some historically, but any examples of where this has happened to countries?
Actually, it happens a lot. Not a lot, but it happens, like the Argentina and the Greek. And sovereign debt default, which will pose a really complex array of challenges within the space of international finance, because due to the intricate interplay and often divergent interest of the involved parties, like creditors, they're not just country, they could be hedge funds, voucher funds, etc. The debtor in nations, the country, the sovereign debtors, and there are lots of international institutions like Paris Club, IMF, the Paris Club. And these stakeholders have their unique objective and limitations, which can result in quite contingent and portrayed process when the sovereign state fails to meet its debt obligations. So creditors typically comprising the private sector's entities and foreign government focus on recovering their investments and may push for stringent repayment terms. On the other hand, debtor nations, sovereign debtors, struggle with economic constraints and seek lenient terms that allow for economic recovery without imposing undue hardship on their populations. International institutions such as the IMF aim to maintain a global financial stability, which often involves balancing the need of fiscal discipline with the social economic well-being of the sovereign debtors' citizens. So the resolution of sovereign debt default necessitates a framework that is not only impartial and equitable, but flexible enough to adopt a unique circumstances for each case. Such a mechanism should ideally facilitate negotiations that leads to sustainable debt restructuring agreement, minimize economic disruptions, and ensure that the sovereign debtors can return to a path of fiscal health and access to international capital markets. Furthermore, the mechanism should foster cooperation among countries to prevent unilateral impositions of terms that could exacerbate financial state instability or lead to undesirable geopolitical consequences. So achieving this balance.
Let me just interrupt for a second there. Thank you. Very interesting. But I guess I want to get back to the very first point. So, and you just alluded to it. Well, who holds the debt? Is it you say, I was thinking maybe like a pension fund. Would countries' pension funds buy national debt? So actually, when a country goes broke, I would hope it not happen to the pension fund I'm in for Scottish Teachers Pension Fund, but possibly that pension funds or other private, investments, I suppose I could put it that way, would suffer or could suffer. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. Since sovereign debt has been considered as one of the safest investment vehicles among the other choices like we have, like shares, options. So pension funds, they are seeking for more safer investment vehicles, safer investment options. So that's why a lot of pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, they do have invest in certain types of sovereign debt and bonds.
Yeah,
so
I suppose a very safe investment, but it depends.
It depends on
the
which
country. I suppose
yes.
Is UK or the US, Germany, I imagine, would be considered
more safe. Japan is very safe as well.
Which one?
Japan
Japan, safe. Yeah, big developed industrial countries would be pretty sure to pay back their debts,
Yes, for the
whereas
global South countries, they might be a bit risky.
yeah, I just was
Yeah.
reading, we have a colleague in law school from Ghana, and Ghana seemed to have had quite a few problems with the
Yes.
IMF recently, and whether they're not generating enough tax dollars, or their level of corruption's too high, or and also one thing I'm worried about, or just not worried about, thinking about, is in what currency is sovereign debt held? Is it normally in
In
dollars,
different currency, but normally in the US dollar.
US dollars? So that would be another big issue then, because the US dollar is relatively stable, but if there was isn't it like high inflation in those countries, then it'd be more difficult for them to repay. Is that accurate? I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm getting a bit off track. So we have these countries borrow a lot of money, and in some situations they can't either pay interest on it even, or pay back when the main sum comes due, and they go in default, or they could do. And so what challenges, you're just mentioning this, what challenges do those present where Argentina can no longer pay its debt? What challenges to international finance or arise as a result?
A chain effect will be initiated. Even though a tiny country, not Argentina, but some really small country, they default, they will still affect the global international financial market. The financial markets will collapse due to the default of a certain country, and also it's really difficult to achieve the balance between different stakeholders involved in the sovereign debt restructuring, which requires diplomacy, financial acumen, and deep understanding of international law. So it's quite difficult to do it in reality.
Yeah, and we spoke about this just before we started, didn't we? And I read a story about China now holding the debt of many countries around the world, and I think we'll come to this a bit later. But also, because the IMF, which steps in when a country defaults.
Yes.
Both China, the IMF, imposing terms on the debtor country.
Yes, we call it that's diplomacy.
Yeah, well, I guess if they more than diplomacy, but some people would call it probably hostage taking or something, because the IMF is, if you want help from us, you must, cut your spending generally, and have more of a free market economy and other sort of terms that the IMF would impose. Is that true?
Yes, and also the IMF will require the sovereign debtors in default to follow the terms if they are going to give them some aid, and then sometimes they need to sacrifice some of their expenditures for educations or for public health for repaying the debt. So this is
so that's why it's unpopular in some circles if you're affected, or if you're into development in general terms or something. Then you think, why is the IMF imposing terms that affect Argentina's ability to fund its hospitals or schools?
Yes.
Okay, so I think and I was again looking at this a little bit over the last 100 or 200 years. There's been issues of sovereign debt, defaults and so forth. I think all around the world, and not just in Asia or Africa, but obviously South America, and Europe. And so then I guess that's one piece of this big puzzle, and the other one in your PhD and or discussion is trust law, and you're suggesting that trust law is a possible solution, or certainly something to assist the problem of sovereign default. Is that right?
Yes, not sovereign debt restructuring is my PhD focus. But my PhD focus isn't about trust law. Trust law is just a really tiny bit of my. I just touch upon sovereign.
Thank you. Yeah.
Trust law, but thank you so much for your questions. So how does trust law offers a solution to complexities of sovereign debt default? Imagine for a moment that you have a friend named Alex. Alex wants to renovate his house. So he borrowed money from several friends, promising to pay them back over time. So this borrowed money is just like country sovereign debt. In simpler terms, when a country needs money for a project, infrastructure, or support its economy, it will borrow money from other countries, institutions, or even from their own citizens. So this borrowed money is the sovereign debt. So now let's say Alex faced unexpected challenges. Maybe his renovations were more expensive than anticipated, or perhaps he lost his job and his income has decreased. Suddenly, paying back his friends becomes difficult. So Alex sits down with his friends and work out a new plan to repay them, maybe by extending the time or adjusting the amount. So this process is what the country refers to sovereign debt restructuring. But that is where the analogy takes a unique twist. Countries are not individuals, and they are certainly not companies. So a company, if it cannot pay its debts, it can just declare bankruptcy, close its doors, and cease to exist, and liquidation. But for countries, it cannot just shut down. They have citizens to care for, service to provide, a role in global community. So while countries can face a lot of financial hardships, they cannot go bankrupt in a traditional sense. They exist perpetually, and therefore their approach to that is inherently different. So when we hear about countries undergoing debt restructuring, it's crucial to remember that this is a way for a country to navigate financial challenges responsibly. And it's about finding a balanced path that respects both lenders and the country citizen. So when countries have a bit difficulties, paying back their loans is a complicated issue to sort out. And so this is where trust law comes in. Think of trust law as a system where someone is giving the responsibility to manage money and ensure it's distributed correctly. It's a bit like having a trust friend hold on to a group's money and then make sure everyone gets their share. So this system is flexible, so it can shape to fit different situations, but it's also strong enough to make sure things are done correctly. So trust law offers a adaptable and a more stable structure that provides an exceptional means for the people to navigate the complexity of sovereign debt default. By forming a trust, trust to manage. Yes.
Yeah, interrupt just for 1 second. So I'm understanding that. But say, I guess there's two questions here. Is how would this scheme differ from what the IMF is doing now? And secondly, will a trust, my view of a trust, understanding of a trust is, a big pot of money put and protected in law and used only for certain purposes and so forth. I don't know an expert in trust. You tell me if I'm wrong. So a trust would have to be funded. So things how does this solution differ from the IMF and then after that, the second question is, and so these are just follow-on questions. I hope you don't mind. And how the trust is funded.
That's a really good question. Trust. So they're different from the IMF. IMF, they are not going to manage a bunch of monies. They're going to give aid for the government. And trust law is a part of the legal system that has been used to help to manage situations when country cannot pay back their debt. So at the core, trust law is about making sure that certain assets or money are kept safe and used in the right way for specified people. And when we think about countries that cannot repay their loans, trust law becoming a tool that because it can help to manage and distribute funds fairly and securely. And maybe I can give you a clear picture of how trust law can operate in this sense.
Yeah, sure. I guess, and one thing that again struck to my head, that if the trust is deciding how a country is going to spend money or to spend its money more responsibly, or
just only during this country is default, not a normal situation.
Yeah. Okay. But even then, so that's just like the normal default. It's a restriction or an impingement on their sovereignty, isn't it? That the country wants to continue to buy tanks and planes.
But when a country is signing off their sovereign debt bonds, they're issuing their sovereign bonds. There's a kind of their sovereignty is a kind of thing that they're going to exclude.
I know it's maybe necessary. So you say the country, okay, that was a very good point. Of course, a company can stop existing, but a country can't. So a country is if it can't pay its debts, it's in a pretty bad predicament. Clearly, currency will collapse, super high inflation, amongst other things, and people may be losing their jobs or going hungry or whatever.
Yes.
So as part, and you're suggesting as a necessary part of that.
Yeah.
That the country would its sovereignty would be restricted, temporarily at least, I think until it gets its feet back on the ground, so to speak. Is that accurate?
Yeah, yes. So when countries borrow money, they usually do so under specified agreement. So two of the most common ones are the official agency agreement and the trust structure. So now you might hear terms like trust indenture in the US and trust deed in the UK. But for our discussion today, think of them as a special agreement or contract. So actually a report has been released from the IMF saying that about 36% of the new international bonds for countries sovereign debt since 2014 used this trust structure. And out of these, 93% were under the New York law. So now a trustee is like a representative for the people who lend the money, especially when countries are struggling to pay back. If a country can't pay its debt or is about to default, the trustee will just step in. So they either enforce the contract or negotiate new terms to help the country repay its debt. Their role is really crucial because they ensure that those who lend the money get to their deal. So it's just like a middle person between the sovereign debtors and the creditors.
Okay, and how would they come to? I think you mentioned New York. I think this is also maybe one in English law, the way that
Yes.
a trust is set up or operates. Who would nominate the trustee, or who would set them up? There would have to be some negotiations. Obviously, the country and the debtors would agree on this third party to how would that come into existence?
I think that part needs more further research on. I'm still thinking about these questions actually.
Yeah. Well, a good one. I guess
That's really
there'd
interesting questions.
have to be a bilateral agreement and something. There'd have to be
It's about bilateral agreements, yes.
Yeah,
but the problem is for sovereign debts, they're quite bizarre. Since you can't find, it's really difficult for you to find a sovereign debt contract between countries in the database. They're not that explicit. And most of the BIA, most of the BIT, the bilateral investment treaties, they have just take sovereign debt out of the pictures after a case in Greek, since they just don't want to classify sovereign debt as a kind of investment for a country.
Yeah, it's such an exceptional circumstance, isn't it?
Yes.
That's what, and you're not going to do that. Okay, so I think you mentioned this, but has trust law been practically applied in cases of sovereign debt defaults up to this point?
Yes.
Yes, has trust.
Yeah, actually, one of the big stories from the world of trust law is about Argentina in 2001. So they had a big debt problem and set up a trust to help they pay back by people they owed money. So a bank called the Bank of New York Mellon was in charge of this trust, making sure everything went by the rules. And because of the trust law, they could find a way to solve the problem and make sure everyone was treated fairly. So this shows that's how trust law can be a real lifesaver when countries have money problems. And another story is about Ecuador between 2008 and 2009. They also had money problems and used trust law to manage the money they got to sort out that. Just like in the Argentina story, a trustee was in charge of the money and then had to follow the trust law rules. But there were some issues. Some experts in international law, they point out that the trustee didn't use their power in their best way. They felt the trustee should have done more to make sure the money was used properly. So actually, these stories tells a lot. But trust law can be a great way to solving big money problems between countries. But also we need to make sure the people in charge as a trustee do their job well. Since trust law is like a safety net, making sure everyone is treated fairly when things go wrong. So it's flexible and can be shaped to fit different scenarios, different problems. In the end, trust law is about finding fair solution to big financial challenges.
Yeah, yes. But I guess I get back to the question, it differs from the role of the IMF may play, because you think it would be more
since they're more private. Yes, they're more flexible than the IMF rules. IMF, there has to be play fair. But trust law, they give fair, but IMF, they need to be accountable. Their main focus is not for the creditors. Their main focus is for the financial stability across the globe. But for trust, they are more pro creditor protections. They just want to protect the creditors.
Okay.
Yeah, more.
Well, that's an interesting point, a different function, I guess, and
Yes.
different, obviously creditors are obviously critically important. I mean, if they're protected, maybe they're more likely to lend, I guess, maybe
Yeah.
the cost of borrowing less, if that's the case,
Yeah.
But then, does either that scheme or indeed the IMF, protect the population of those countries, or the social services or the others, or do you think they would be treated the same, or would a trustee or this trust mechanism, would it be more likely to take into account the interests of education or health in a country that's defaulted, or not? I mean, to my understanding I remember Argentina, I think, and the IMF, well, in that and in other cases around the world, has been heavily criticized as being forcing further misery on the populations by cutting public spending, raising taxes in order to improve the financial health of the country. From an economic point of view, entirely sensible. But from a humanitarian point of view, one could think, well, that's does cause hardship. Is that, is there any difference in this trust scheme from the IMF in that respect? How
I think
individuals could be affected?
Pretty simply, I think IMF, they're looking for a bigger picture, but for the trustee, they are just focusing on that particular case. Since IMF, if they're doing anything, they cannot do a lot of drama thing. But for trustee, they are more tailor-made, more flexible for that particular situation. Okay, so that's why trust is more flexible than the IMF approach.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So now I think we talked about the strengths and limitations of trust law, but how do you think it might happen in the future, develop in the future? How might the use of trust law influence the future of international finance? Is it possible that it would perhaps stop further sovereign debt defaults or mitigate them?
I think it could significantly impact the global finance. It could lead to a more secured and predictable financial environment for the investors, not just for the investors, not just for the creditors, but also for the sovereign debtors, which will reduce the likelihood of future default and promote a more stability in financial markets. Its successful implementations could signify the shift towards a more collaborative debt restructuring and emphasize the international cooperation in finance, and without the intervention of many other parties.
Yeah. That's really could be quite important and quite a very useful addition to international finance if that did in fact happen.
Yes.
The countries you've given the examples of the consequences.
Exactly. And one more thing about the use of trust law, which will influence the future international finance. If the countries start to use trust law, more countries using trust law, maybe a credit rating agency like Fitch and Fitch ratings, they can maybe they need to maybe they need to change the methodology in evaluating what does it mean by a good country. The rating for the country. If they issue debt bonds through trust indentures, maybe they will get high ratings. This is something maybe the credit rating agency needs to consider in the future. Yeah,
well, that's a good point, and I don't know if everybody, I think I know a little bit about that. Understand that a country, just like I suppose an individual, can be given a credit rating.
Yes,
and
exactly.
That affects the interest rate at which you could borrow. Right, because if you have a low credit rating, you're deemed to be a higher risk, right? Is that accurate? And so then if you're higher risk, of course, the lender is going to want to charge you more interest because there's a greater likelihood the institution is not going to get this money back. So they want to make sure that they're paid for assuming that risk. And if you get, so that's a good point. And then, I mean, I think that could also. And I was wondering, and I don't know the exact stats on this, but I assume the UK's got a fairly good credit rating, even though I thought it was affected by just the scale of the debt arising through.
Not really. The UK still got really good ratings.
Yeah. And then, but even
It's
then,
always relative.
how much
Because
interest is it paying on, like, I thought it was like, I don't know if I was right or not, 2.5 trillion pounds. Like, and this is what I was thinking, and anybody going into debt on their credit card or something or anything. I mean, it's not a good idea to be heavily indebted, because then you just pay your current income. Like, how much of our taxes presently paid to the UK government purely go to service that national debt? I don't know the figure. Is it 10%, 20% of our taxes, as opposed to going on the NHS or higher education or the environment or such like. So, okay, so we talked a bit about the possible future. I think maybe we can end for talking for 5 or 10 minutes about what I began with is China. And I read just coincidentally in the Guardian, I think 2 or 3 days ago, a story about China has become the biggest. What was the quote? I wrote it down. The biggest debt collector in the world. That it is owed itself $1.5 trillion. It said in the Guardian, and it has gone over the last not that long. I would have thought maybe 10 or 15 years or less even, lending money and engaging with developing countries in Africa and Asia in particular, and South America.
Yeah.
And helping build into infrastructure, and maybe in the course of that, lending money, so building the infrastructure at its own expense, China's own expense, but the debt is assumed by the country where the roads or airports are built. And then now it's happening so long, or to such an extent that maybe China's facing problems in being paid back. I think, is that the case? And there's I think a famous example, and you can tell us about, in the African country of Zambia. Is that what's happened in China Zambian relations?
Yes, actually, Zambia's recent debt crisis could shed some light on the broader dynamics of sovereign debt restructuring, particularly in the context of China's lending practice in Africa. So in November 2020, Zambia defaulted on its sovereign debt, making it the first African country to default on its Eurobonds during the COVID-19 pandemic. So a significant portion of this debt is owed to China, which is the world's second largest sovereign creditor after the World Bank. World Bank is the first largest one, but China is the second one. So the case of Zambia underscores China's bilateral approach to that agreement, whereas it negotiate terms directly with the debtor countries rather than to adhering a multilateral framework. So this approach provides insight into the China's strategy of negotiating with debtors outside confines of Paris Club. So Paris Club is a group that has historically coordinated solutions for debtor countries, and they are situated in Paris. And while China's extensive lending activities has positioned its major global creditors, there are some concerns about its transparency and the sustainability of its lending practice have arisen. So Zambia's situations exemplifies the challenge that arises when countries grapple with significant debt from major creditors like China. And the implications of Zambia's debt crisis extend beyond its border. So the challenges posed by sovereign debt and decentralized framework for debt restructuring can threaten international financial stability. So given that China's substantial lending to multiple African countries, so Zambia experience is a kind of question for us regarding the potential risk and reward associated with China's lending practice on this continent.
Yeah, okay, maybe more specific details. Has China imposed particular terms on Zambia after it defaulted, or is it seen to be a reasonable creditor, and that say it extended the terms of a loan or lowered the interest rates, or cut it some slack, indeed maybe just accepted that it wouldn't be repaid in full? Or what was China's approach when this happened?
Yeah, and so actually there's a concerns over the terms for loan sustainability for the funds projects by China. And notably, actually, China's lending terms coupled with allegation of debt trap diplomacy, which has apprehension about China's intentions and the long
a debt trap. Yeah, so they owe so much money that gives China a very significant position vis-a-vis that country because that country's financial stability relies on China's
But even though there is a lot of people accusing there is a debt trap imposed by China against the African countries and countries from the global south, there is no specific, a very concrete evidence that China is exploiting the countries in that behalf. I read some studies. They said they have found that there is no evidence suggests that they have exploited natural resources of Zambia by imposing that. Maybe there is something hidden, I don't know. But from what we can see, there is nothing.
Yeah, I think that's a fair response. I mean, I would say on the other side of the coin, and that the United States or other countries or similarly could be accused of with the United States either unilaterally or operating through the World Bank, having the top seat at the World Bank, operating through that institution, or going to cut deals that are in its interests. So if China is acting somewhat similarly, you can't say, well, China's the bad one in this example.
That's an easy answer, but the problem is we cannot make such conclusion without concrete evidence. So
so I agree.
That's why further study need to be done. And the problem is that contract between China with other country, they are not transparent. You can't find it. It's really difficult to find it. But there are several research projects has been initiated to try to gather the contract, the soft-funded contract between China and another country.
And I guess the cost of this, or the benefit of this debt, by and large, was infrastructure in these countries. And I know that,
or diplomacy, or some political move. I don't know.
But I mean, what was the money was spent on by and large, isn't it? Was infrastructure in these developing
infrastructure? I think mostly.
So any examples of ports and roads and airports and Okay, so I think maybe this is our last question. We're maybe getting back to Zambia. Well, what contributed to its debt crisis in particular, and then how is China? And we were just discussing this, but we could maybe talk a little bit more about it. How has China's lending practices influenced Zambia's economic and political landscape? What is the position today? Do you know?
So actually, Zambia's that has a really serious debt crisis. Actually, can be attributable to multiple factors, both internal and external. So internally, the country has an economic challenge due to the government's expenditures, declining commodity price, notably the copper major export, and adverse effect of the COVID-19 pandemic is almost one of the internal reason. Although the pandemic aggravated Zambia's debt issues, it did not signify to cause them. Additionally, the Zambia's leadership, the president, has the Zambia witnessed the politics and the actions as argument is debt level. So the lack of economic diversifications and instance of poor administrations further accelerates the country's financial woes. But externally, Zambia's increased reliance on Chinese external debts, especially for the public work, has significantly shaped its debt profile. China's lending practice in Africa, particularly within the Belt and Road Initiative, have been subject to scrutiny. So maybe there are some concerns about it on the terms of the loan. Sustainability of the funded projects or potential for the debt distress in the receiving countries has been raised. And this is something I've mentioned previously today about the China lending terms, the debt trap diplomacy. But in Zambia's case, the high level of debt rendered the government unable to pay its debt and import essential goods, leading to a foreign currency shortage and stolen economic growth. So the disparity figures report by Zambia's government and the World Bank regarding the country's external debt further accentuates the concerns about the transparency. With China being Zambia's largest creditors, the debt restructuring process and its outcomes hold significant implications for Zambia's future economic trajectory. Since China is one of the largest creditors for Zambia, Zambia's economic right now is basically controlled by China indirectly. This is just my thought.
No, very good. That's a very good point. I mean, I guess only time will tell in the future if say it's a combination of factors, but commodity prices or Zambian governance are such that it can recover. Okay, thank you very much. I see we've only got about quarter to the hour. I see
Some questions.
yes, we got let me here go up. We got 5 or 6 of them or something, I think.
Yeah. Well, we got 6 questions.
Yeah, so I'll maybe read them and I give you a little chance to think. And if when I'm reading the first one out, I think is somebody I remember, a former student of ours, and she's worked in insolvency and restructuring of companies, but sovereign debt isn't a topic she's considered much before. How would you propose the regulation of assigning debt and ensuring countries wouldn't take advantage of the trust structure?
That's why the governing law for the sovereign debt country, for that sovereign debt contract is really important. 90%, a lot of, most, actually 90%, it's just a figure by myself, but most of the sovereign debt contract are governed by either English law or New York law. So that's why New York law and English law, they're quite, they can protect the trustee interest. But if they're choosing other law, then I'm not sure.
Yeah,
so
well, I suppose then ultimately, I don't know if this makes any sense or not, but say, for wouldn't take advantage of the trust structure, and then ultimately, if there was a dispute, would there be binding arbitration between the country and who would the other party be? Would it be the trust itself, or I don't know what would happen if, say, a country was not adhering to the terms? What would, in a dispute arose, what would happen?
It depends on the contract itself, actually.
Yeah,
it's hard to say at this point. So sovereign debt is a really interesting thing, since unlike other types of investment, sovereign debt is quite chaotic. We don't have a unified approach to govern sovereign debt related things.
Like what, and you say that the difference between countries and other concerns, say companies, ultimately
exactly
the country's going to exist, and that's a fundamental point. Okay, well, I think that's the first one. And the second one, what was the overall effect of the Argentinian trust scheme? Has any significant change been observed? Was there did the Argentina go through the trust scheme?
Yes, actually, Argentina in 2001 they had a problem, and then the trust helped to pay back by the people they owed money to. So a bank called the Bank of New York Mellon has been appointed as a trustee for that case. So as a trustee, they just want to make sure everything is went by the rules. And because of trust law, they could find a way to solve the problem and make sure every creditors are treated fairly. So just kind of show that how trust law can be a real lifesaver when countries have money troubles. It's like a guidebook that helps everyone to find a way out in a tricky situation. And so maybe.
And what are the rules and governing this money allocation? And this is the trust is ensuring that certain money is spent in a certain way. Where are those rules? Are those in the terms of the trust, or where?
Terms of the trust, terms of the contract, and the trustee takes charge of the money and ensure it's used correctly based on the rules of trust law by the governing law, maybe in English law and in the New York law. So the approach is special because it separates who owns money and who controls how it's spent. So it creates bonds of trust between the trustee and people lending the money, making sure the lender's needs are always considered, and which ensure that the money is shared out fairly, keeping the lender's best interest in mind.
Okay, so, thank you, Charles. I think
it's a great thing. Yes.
Yeah, so I think this next question maybe gets a little more, explains this better than, or the question is posed better than mine. Normally, trusts hold the subject of a trust for the benefit of another, right? Yes. In this case, how does the trust arrangement work? Who is the beneficiary? And who would be the trustee? And what would be the subject of the trust? So this is maybe basically, transforming trust law as we probably understand it within Scots law in the international. So who is the beneficiary? The beneficiary is the country, I assume?
Yeah, beneficiary is not the country. Beneficiary, trustor, settler in Scotland is the country, the sovereign debtors. And in this case, the trustee is the bank or is someone that the country appoint. And for the beneficiaries, which is the lender, the creditors, is the beneficiaries in this case. And the trustee's role is to make sure the creditor has been treated fairly in a flexible manner.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that would be the okay. I think I understand that. So here's, I think there's our maybe our final question. Well, there's a couple more. Are contracts between countries regulated by any independent body? This is a good point about what happens if there's a dispute or an enforcement issue.
Yeah, it's about the governing law and the dispute resolution clauses. So it depends. The question is.
Yeah. So I guess there could be. I mean, is there some permanent court of arbitration or any other body that
even arbitral tribunal can do it? But because of there is a mass claim for the the Greek sovereign debt crisis previously, because they have a IIA, the International Investment Agreement, that contain a clause that sovereign debt is one of the investment that has been considered as an investment. So that's why the people they can initiate a mass claim against the government. They violate the International Investment Agreement. So now after that, a lot of countries, they just explicitly state that sovereign debt is not as an investment, but under the International Investment Agreement, the BIT, the Bilateral Investment Agreement as well.
Not the bilateral, so that would which have terms for
yes, just want to protect themselves against the mass claim by the creditors.
Yeah. So then what happens in that case if there's no dispute settlement clause or no agreement that applies?
They do have other dispute settlement clauses, but not a mass claim. They can still suit under the sovereign debt contract between the company. Unlike a human being, our country is really challenging for creditors to seize the property of a country, of a sovereign debtors, if the sovereign debtors go default. But in many years ago, there is a case involved Russian government. I think he's a U.S. citizen. I'm not sure I remember it correctly. A U.S. citizens try to seize the property of Russia outside in U.S. because they didn't repay the debt.
Yeah, I wonder over that. We'll just say recently in a wholly different context, not because Russia was in debt, but because it was arguably using its money to pursue the war in Ukraine. That
yes.
Assets in the UK and I think throughout Europe, all the news was the super yachts, but all these other things, maybe even Chelsea Football Club was the beneficial owners were, well, the football club I think were prevented from operating, so sold it, and then I think the yachts were just impounded, so far as I understand. Okay, well, that's very interesting. Our final question, and we're just about out of time. Using this idea of using trust law in dealing with sovereign debt, can you show how this would be applicable in real life situations? So I guess is what we spoke about already a little bit.
Yes, and also the Paris Club play a really important role between countries and between sovereign debtors and sovereign creditors. Basically, the Paris Club is a group of wealthy sovereign creditors. They group together, and then the sovereign debtors, if they cannot repay the debt, and then the sovereign creditors, they just in the Paris Club meeting, they will issue a minute, and then minutes will become agreement. Then the agreement will just make the sovereign debtors' life easier. Then they can pay later in different terms. And there are a lot of permanent members of the Paris Club, but China, they just not willing to join as there's no evidence to suggest that they're going to join as a permanent members of the Paris Club, because once you join as a permanent members of the Paris Club, you need to share your information with the other permanent members about your debt with other countries. Maybe this is something that China don't want to do. They just want to keep something secret. Okay,
yeah. Wants its debt arrangements to be private. Okay, well, hopefully a quick answer to this one. So is the trustee like an administrator or a receiver? Would you say, is that an accurate way?
Kind of. Yeah, kind of, I think. Yeah. Could be one of them, yeah.
Okay. Well, yes. I think we're just not going to wrap up now. I would say now to thank everybody for those interesting and relevant questions. That was very useful. Thank you very much.
Yes, if you are really interested in this area, actually, I've published an article on this area on the trust and trustee. And then if you are interested, you can try to find it online then, or you can send me an email. I can send it to you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, that's a good offer. Thank you. So, Charles, it can easily be found on the RGU law staff pages, or indeed, so can I. And you can email me, and I'll pass it on to Charles. So that's a kind offer. Thank you, Charles. It just leaves me now to thank Colin and Graham in the alumni office for helping organize this tonight. That's much appreciated. And then finding Charles for taking part. That's very illuminating. I learned a lot. I know a little bit about sovereign debt, as you could tell, but I suppose a little knowledge is often a dangerous thing. And I hope I didn't ask you any really stonker wrong questions.
No, it's really good. Actually, you make you think a lot. Something I didn't think of. I think I need to think about it.
Well, that's what kind of you to say. And I guess we could have another chat leading up to your Viva, maybe without to read your PhD.
Yes, I think I need it. So thank you so
I'm
much.
sure you're not. I mean, I'm sure you're not.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much again, everybody, and just a little pre-notice for people out there. We're having our final webinar this semester in December. Okay, thank you very much, Charles. Yeah, thanks a lot. Okay,
Thank you so much.
Everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.